Hello, we are back with part 2 of our deep dive into the very enigmatic Alberto Sicilia Falcon. If you've landed here first, I'd recommend checking out part 1, as it is full of details you wouldn't want to miss on his backstory, the rise of his organization, and the man himself. This is where things escalate. Sicilia Falcon wasn't content with just being a drug trafficker. He was chasing something far bigger, and the crazy thing is, he very nearly attained it. If you're enjoying this series and you're not subscribed yet, please feel free to do so. No need to smash the like button. You can gently click on it and treat it with some love and care. Thank you. So, what became of this seismic figure in Mexico's drug trade? What did he really want? If you've already watched part 1, you've already gotten the hints. Now it's time for the nitty-gritty. We know that the smuggler Alberto Barrueta, after surviving an assassination attempt at the hands of hired enforcer Michael Decker, went into hiding and began collaborating with the DEA. He had initially been arrested by federal police in Tijuana. Fearing for his life in a Mexican jail, he tricked the federales into taking him over the border to speak with American agents, then wound up in federal witness protection, informing against Falcon's organization. Michael Decker would follow soon after. Once he himself became a walking target, Decker fled Mexico, lay low in Albuquerque, and worked at a local health spa. Eventually, he was approached by DEA agents working on Falcon's case, following a tip-off from an undercover police officer. In conversation at the spa, Decker had bragged to him about his connections to the drug trade. And it was once these two witnesses began appearing before grand federal juries in San Diego that things started moving very quickly. The US started putting serious pressure on Mexican agencies to go after Falcon and his criminal counterparts. Investigations on the ground were ramped up. A new analysis of telephone tolls traced Falcon to a couple of townhouses in Colonia Pedregal, southwest Mexico City. Most of the calls were coming out of a modest 2-story home at 180 Calle Nieve. 2 Mexico-based DEA agents surveilled the house and were able to track the comings and goings of a Mercedes, driven and leased by an American national named Joan Beck. A resourceful, influential member of the organization, it turned out she was also the lover of Carlos Kiriakides, Tijuana's #1 socialite and Falcon's close lieutenant. They were tracked running trips between Falcon's pad and the business's HQ at the El Presidente Hotel. Fresh intel came in from the San Diego office that Kiriakides was in Mexico City to receive a large cocaine shipment. This was later followed up with reports that Falcon's twin-engine Beach Duke had left Tulsa and was already bound for Mexico City. Ed Heath, the head of DEA in Mexico, received the memo and he's already ready to act upon its intel. He reaches out to his friend and close colleague, Florentino Ventura Gutierrez. Reported as one of the most powerful cops in Latin America, Ventura was as efficient as he was ruthless, both feared and revered. A decade later, he would spearhead the police crackdown in the aftermath of the Kiki Camarena torture murder, personally arresting and torturing Guadalajara kingpin Rafael Caro Quintero. Bent on taking down Falcon, Ventura orders round-the-clock surveillance of key targets, properties, and vehicles. Kiriakides and Joan Beck are spotted once again driving to Falcon's hideout and entering the premises. After a short while, they're seen leaving again and start to drive off. When Kiriakides realizes he's being tailed by a convoy of surveillance vehicles, he goes full GTA. He speeds up, skids and swerves, hits the brakes, then tries to ram into the surveillance car behind. After that, he floors the accelerator, crosses a grass divider, and careers down a one-way street in the wrong direction. That's when Ventura makes the call. He orders his men to take them down. The police cars swiftly encircle the Mercedes, Kiriakides and Beck are arrested, and they're returned to 180 Calle Nieve. Upstairs, the police find the man himself in the flesh. Sicilia Falcon is in bed. He's lying there with a cast over a broken foot due to a riding accident just a few days earlier. As soon as Falcon sees them, he reaches out for his .45 automatic. That is when he is overwhelmed by the officers. His head and ears are promptly flanked by Ingram submachine guns. Ventura and a DEA agent walk in. According to Falcon, they start questioning him about the shipment. And so he plays dumb. We're told he reaches for his checkbook, fills in 6 zeros, and tells Ventura, "Put any number you like in front of the zeros and get the hell out of here." Big mistake. The commander rejects the bribe. As Falcon carries on feigning ignorance, Ventura's driver hits his broken foot with the butt of his gun, and Falcon is in agony. He makes another grab for the table and goes for a file card, tears it up, and stuffs the lot into his mouth. The DEA agent shakes him up, forces him to spit it out. Once parceled back together later on, it would spell out the name of a South American cocaine supplier. That is the mafia code in action right there. 24 police soon swarm the residence, armed to the teeth with hand grenades, machine guns, and automatic rifles. They only find about 200 grams of cocaine. But they do find Falcon's 2 passports, one under an alias, and other mystifying ID documents, which we'll go into later. Thus was raised the Great Hall of Mirrors over Falcon's international connections. In 6 different cars, Falcon, Kyriakides, Beck, and other house staff and associates are taken to the dungeons of the Procuraduría, the Attorney General's office. Ventura actually spends the night at the safe house to nab any unsuspecting associates dropping by. The first one to arrive is Falcon's chauffeur. He arrives early the next morning. Then comes another trafficker called Luis Sucoli Bravo, who's bearing written instructions on how to turn cocaine paste into crystals. Later on, Gaston Santos himself turns up with his pregnant wife. But after Santos presents a government badge which connects him to the very top of Mexico's state ladder, the couple is released almost immediately. In the evening, a man called José Egozi Bejar appears. He is a multi-millionaire Cuban-American businessman based out of Miami, an arms dealer, international finance whiz, and a CIA-trained Bay of Pigs veteran. More on that later. Egozi resists during arrest and takes a blow on the side of the head which bursts his eardrum. All except Santos are taken to the dungeons. Over the next few days, Sicilia Falcon and his associates are brutally tortured. By the drug lord's own account, he was beaten. His broken foot was repeatedly bashed in. His nipples, stomach, and testicles shocked by an electric cattle prod. He was sleep-deprived, tormented, wired up, and electrocuted. He even stated that after spoiling himself, a doctor was called in. The doctor told his torturers that Falcon's life wasn't in any imminent danger and that they could proceed. What they were after, Falcon writes, was a signed confession, and this he eventually signed after hours of torture, a statement narrated by Ventura in which Falcon confessed to trafficking 3,000 tons of marijuana and 1.5 tons of cocaine. Forced confessions are a common tactic used by Mexican federal policemen on arrested drug traffickers, and therefore a common legal charge in the trafficker's defense. Bordering on insanity, Falcon later tries to kill himself by slashing his wrists, first unsuccessfully with a ripped plastic cup in his cell, then with a Catholic medallion, having sharpened the edges on the concrete floor. The blood seeps under the cell door and into the prison corridor. Panicked inmates alert the guards and Falcon is rushed to the hospital. He writes that the doctor who treats him insists on having him admitted, but his captors refuse. He's taken back to his cell with 3 other inmates. At least the torture had stopped. Before long, Falcon is transferred. He's taken to Lecumberri prison, just northeast of Mexico City's historical center. Now home to the National Archives, it was popularly known as the Black Palace and was inspired by Jeremy Bentham's infamous panopticon design. Prison officials were notoriously corrupt there. Falcon ended up buying 2 whole cells, a bedroom, then a living room to receive visitors, while paying tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on special privileges. Meanwhile, a storm was raging in Mexico. News of Falcon's capture and torture had sent local media in a frenzy. Journalists were reporting that under torture, Falcon had confessed to being a CIA agent, a charge he would later deny. And there was another particularly explosive story. Mexican superstar Irma Serrano, who had dated or was dating Sicilia Falcon at the time, was approached by Mexican journalists. Nicknamed the Tigress for a fiery demeanor, Serrano was ballistic about Falcon's torture and incarceration, and she threatened to go public with the identities of all the politicians, police heads, and journalists in cahoots with drug traffickers. Said she'd provide names and details, quote, only with the authorization of President Echeverria. Now, this absolutely terrifies Mexico's elite, and Washington is asking questions. It's like she's holding a hand grenade to the entire mafia state system. Everybody goes quiet, officials stick to their offices and refuse to answer any phone calls. It was clear the matter had gotten completely out of hand. At the same time, Falcon's empire is in shambles. US pressure is at a high and arrest warrants are being dished out on both sides of the border. Most of the previous arrests, including Falcon's, had in fact been without warrants. DEA manages to take down Roger Fry, Falcon's stateside representative, and Fry's financial trail simply baffles them, with hundreds of millions stashed away in Swiss bank accounts, and those were only the Swiss ones. Fry's distribution network had stretched from coast to coast. Dozens of Class 1 violators go down, and these aren't loutish street thugs either. These are white-collar, university graduates, many even practicing lawyers. The sophistication of the network was just mind-expanding. Through his legions of lawyers, Falcon tries to mount a defense in Mexico. I couldn't find much about it in public sources, but it was likely a farce. Politicians needed Falcon to stay quiet, and they needed his money to stay in Mexico. For that, he needed to stay in jail. And so, Falcon and his captive associates decided, quite simply, to escape. Less than 10 months into Falcon's prison sentence, a contact of his makes the arrangements to purchase a small, unremarkable house just across the street from the prison. Bought it for 3 times its value. DEA speculated this contact was the father of Luis Zuccoli Bravo, Falcon's partner who was arrested at the house, carrying the instructions for turning cocaine base into crystal. Mexican newspaper Milenio, though, reported it was Zuccoli's uncle. Either way, the Zuccoli Bravo family were clearly aides, and the recipients of at least $50,000 US by Falcon's own confession. And a Lieutenant Colonel Edilbert Gil Cardenas, who had long been an enthusiastic recipient of Falcon's bribes while in jail, was paid an alleged $160,000 to permit the escape. Now, regarding the actual plans, well, a team of engineers was gathered. For over 2 months, those engineers would barely see the light of day. They had one job, that was to dig an underground tunnel approximately 40 meters long and 80 centimeters wide between that house and Falcon's cell, number 30 in Wing L, parallel to the southern wall. The tunnel would stretch underneath the highway and then under the deeply entrenched walls of the prison. It was a mammoth undertaking. Messy, grueling, logistically harrowing, and extremely dangerous. Besides the sheer difficulty of the labor, the engineers faced periodic flash flooding, a high risk of cave-ins, landslides, and dehumanizing isolation. Mutinies regularly flared. Unanticipated obstacles, like the discovery of a second insurance wall in the prison, to name one, only prolonged the exasperation. Just a few details. Scaffolding beams fit to size, stuffed inside mattresses, were smuggled inside the house. 275 tons of dirt in total were excavated. Initially, the dirt was poured out of a hole, drilled into the back seat of a Volkswagen, taken on regular trips throughout the city. Once the dirt started coming in larger volumes, though, it was simply piled up around the house, right up to the ceiling. In April 1976, about 10 months after Falcon's arrest, the tunnelers had reached the point directly below Falcon's cell. Alerted by a knock on the floor, he and his associates drilled into the concrete for the final section. There's an anecdote from an associate who'd visited Falcon a few days before the Great Escape. A prison guard at Lecumberri, hoping to ingratiate himself with the Cuban, had for whatever reason, painted him a picture of a lion. Falcon took a box, painted it black, and cut strips out the sides to mimic the bars of a prison cell. And then he popped the image of the lion inside. On the morning of the 26th of April, 1976, the prison guards discovered that Falcon and 3 associates had escaped during the night. After knocking down the door, locked on the inside, they found not only a gaping hole in the floor, but also that same enclosure with the lion image inside. Only it had one difference: the bars had been opened. Needless to say, the manhunt was on. It was in fact one of the largest police hunts in Mexico City until then. No surprises there. Mexican officials were terrified of what he could reveal. DEA, in a worldwide communique, announced his escape, writing, "Falcon has a homosexual psychopathic personality. Watch out, he's psychopathic and homosexual. Lock up your doors. He is known to use automatic weapons and should be considered armed and dangerous." Just 3 days later, in Mexico City's Colonia Narvarte, Falcon is rearrested. He'd spent the last few days bouncing between safe houses, at times disguised as an old man. Turns out the police had tortured the prison commander who'd aided Falcon's escape, and he gave up Falcon's safe houses. The police track him down at Calle Quemada, and after his shootout on the property's rooftop, Falcon surrenders. He later writes that to subdue him, the police used Carlos, Falcon's protege and adopted son, as a human shield, with a gun at his head. Carlos was later beaten. According to Falcon, after being brought down from the rooftop, Ventura tries to take him outside onto the street where police are still firing at the front door. That way, Ventura could claim Falcon was resisting and just take him out. But then, Falcon finds himself jostled around in a tangled mesh of arms. Men in civilian clothing surround him and force him inside a car. These aren't Ventura's men, and they're not police. Falcon doesn't specify in his memoir, was it Santos's men, CIA, men sent by Mexican officials fearful of what Falcon might confess? We're not sure. I would hedge my bets on it being Santos's men, potentially with the connivance of other Mexican officials. What we do know is that because of them, Falcon was spared Ventura's torture, and therefore potentially explosive confessions. Now, he's taken to the Procuraduría. Ventura is there. As it turns out, another man is there too, the second in command over Mexico's National Intelligence Agency, the Directorate of Federal Security. He is also the CIA's main pointman in Mexico. We'll go into this a little later. But he manages to rein in Ventura, who is incensed and bent on torturing Falcon. The intelligence boss starts leveling with the Cuban, says he can guarantee his safety as long as he tells him where his 3 fugitive associates are. Falcon says he doesn't know. And so the Cuban is taken back to Lecumberri prison. Later, he'll be transferred to the Reclusorio Oriente in Mexico City. The media storm eventually died out, and the story of Sicilia Falcon faded into near oblivion. 10 years later, it was resurrected to an American readership with the publication of The Underground Empire by James Mills, before fading once again. And more recently, of course, Narcos Mexico revived Falcon's legend to a mass audience, and yet his story remains practically unknown. We know he carried on trafficking for a while behind bars. He was still in business with former associates, primarily moving cocaine. But that likely fizzled out. Scattered evidence online suggests he owned a bookstore while behind bars at Reclusorio Oriente. He also had a falcon with him called Homer. Another anecdote goes that later, at Santa Marta prison in Mexico City, he was running a snack bar, but got the alcohol concession revoked as he was caught cutting the rum with water. Official and media reports of when he got out of jail were patchy and contradictory. The little we know about his life after prison was largely gleaned by journalist and author Jesse Fink, following an interview with Falcon's sister, Mercedes. At first, Mercedes stated he got out in 2001, but in a follow-up call, corrected the date to 1994. An innocent memory lapse? Perhaps. Which means Falcon was behind bars for just under 2 decades. Luis Nabia, the Cuban cocaine trafficker whose memoir Jesse Fink was compiling, worked with Falcon between 96 and 98, while Falcon, then relying on a cane to walk, was trying to get back into the game, looking for a Colombian connection. At the time, Falcon was protected by El Azul, Sinaloa and Godfather figure and cartel peace broker, real name Juan José Esparragosa Moreno. We're told that in 2011, Sicilia Falcon died of a stroke, or of a heart attack. The latter is according to his sister. She told Jesse Fink that Falcon had frontal lobe brain cancer, which he had nearly overcome, but then died a few days before another round of surgery. Hard to tell. In all likelihood, it's true. But in Mexico, anything goes. Falcon had a lot of dirt on Mexican officials and others, so he was a walking target, which could be a motivation to fake one's death. On the flip side, he likely used this dirt to his advantage, to help him stay alive for as long as he did. It's very possible, in fact, that he had one or more confidants with whom he'd arranged to spill the beans if ever the state tried to off him. Being in the spotlight, though, that can get you killed. So him being alive isn't strictly impossible. His sister could have covered for him, with all due respect to her. I would probably invoke Occam's razor, though, and hedge my bets on Falcon being deceased. Do write your thoughts in the comments section. But now, ladies and gentlemen, the big one. For most traffickers, money and survival are the end game. Sicilia Falcon was clearly dreaming big. The guy wanted real governmental power, and he had the connections, shadowy connections, going in all sorts of directions, which could help him attain his objectives. So, how close did he actually get? Okay, this is where Falcon's story gets very odd. I've said it before, there is not nearly enough material on this guy or his instrumental place in the Mexican drug trade. In his 1979 memoir, The Tunnel of Lecumberri, Sicilia Falcon recorded something very strange that happened to him. It all began in 1967. You'll recall that Falcon had been an anti-Castroist partisan, involved in raids with other Cuban emigres, funded by the CIA. He tells us that after the ill-fated mission, where his comrades were ambushed and massacred by Castro's forces, he never returned to the base in Miami and quit his activities with the CIA. But he also tells us that in that year, he was approached by a, quote, mysterious visitor who wanted him back with the, quote, organization, heavily implied as the CIA, for one last mission as a Cuban infiltrator. When Falcon refused, this mystery man went on to tell him around the States, and he made his and his wife's lives a complete misery. After refusing a second time, Falcon ended up losing his job. His home was vandalized. He was forced to move houses. And as the couple zigzagged across the states fleeing the, quote, invisible hand, their desperation and squeezed pockets frayed away at their marriage, culminating in divorce. Now, this is something that would be very difficult to verify. It could be an embellishment and/or it could be a red herring. It's not uncommon for convicted drug traffickers to present themselves as victims of unjust persecution. And he does go on to say that it was this persecution which forced him to go to Mexico, where he went on to buy, quote, land to develop for tourism and became involved in exporting shellfish. But he also writes that once he moved down to Tijuana in March 1971, the same mystery man had managed to track him down. At the time, Falcon was in a relationship with Mercedes Coleman, the Cuban-American trafficker we mentioned earlier, a big mover in Central America and the mother of Carlos, whom Falcon would later adopt. This is the extract from the memoir, starting off with the words of the agent. "You thought we'd lose your track in Mexico, but you were wrong. We know everything you've done. We know all about the activities of your woman. Don't you know she's involved in the narcotics business?" It was a rude shock. I could not imagine Mercedes involved in something illegal. Pause. As an aside, it's highly improbable Falcon didn't know this. In fact, it's documented he was in business with her, as well as the Hérnandez brothers. But moving on. She's under arrest right now, the mysterious visitor said, and it would be very easy for us to involve you in it with her. But we want to give you one last chance. Either you come back with us, or you already know what you're in for. Now, this raises some questions. Sicilia Falcon is clearly setting up the idea that the CIA wanted him back. If true, how did he get out of the blackmail and spare himself a prison sentence? Did he cooperate with the CIA another way besides working for them in Cuba? Putting aside the actual veracity of the story, why did he write this? Is it just to portray himself as a victim of foreign persecution? Is it fictional spy novel-esque writing? Or is it something more? A warning? Whistleblowing? The obvious question presents itself. Did Falcon remain affiliated with the CIA while building his trafficking empire? Charges of CIA collusion with drug traffickers in Latin America alone, never mind in Asia, has been a long-running saga, from the more concrete evidence of CIA toleration of traffickers affiliated with the Contras in Nicaragua, or that of former Panamanian president and drug trafficker Manuel Noriega, over to the more recent allegations from DEA whistleblower Héctor Bereyes around a CIA drugs for arms conspiracy with the Guadalajara cartel, supposedly unearthed by a string of individuals from the Mexican journalist Manuel Buendia, murdered in 1984, to the now legendary DEA agent Enrique Camarena. But nowadays, Sicilia Falcon's story has largely been overlooked in favor of his successors. Here we have an actual CIA asset who was extracted from Cuba by the CIA along with his family, who worked with partisan militias funded by the CIA, and whom we're told, after going rogue, built the largest drug trafficking organization perhaps in the world within less than half a decade. Could he have achieved this just from his contacts in the Mexican government? Yes, perhaps. He was indeed very high up. For those of you who've watched part 1, wink wink nudge nudge, go watch it if you haven't, you might remember a mention of a meeting at the Conquistador Hotel in Mexico City. It was described by the contracted American enforcer Michael Decker, and allegedly ended up with hired gunmen getting blown up to smithereens because their employer had violated a verbal agreement with Falcon. Well, turns out that meeting was scheduled for the investment in the manufacture of a weapon called the M101C rifle, a powerful, laser-guided assault weapon doubling as a rocket launcher. Now, we don't know the fate of this super rifle as it was branded, but we do know that Falcon and his partner Gaston Santos were interested in investing millions to get it going. At $40 a piece, they could send them to guerrillas in Central America in exchange for cocaine worth millions in California. We should perhaps first ask ourselves how Falcon was introduced to the owner of the arms company, Mr. James Morgan. Decker testified in court and went on the record with Mills to say he saw 2 documents from the CIA at his first meeting with Falcon. He said one document was a memo on the Morgan rifle, detailing how it could be used by a small group of soldiers to overpower much larger units. The other was a communique suggesting the CIA should consider getting involved with the weapon, and that Falcon was a possible financier. Further, Mills tells us about a Bolivian diplomat called Sara La Señor. She was present at Falcon's meeting with James Morgan, and it turns out she was vice president of Morgan Arms. Now, Mills doesn't provide his source, but he writes that La Señor was reportedly smuggling narcotics into the US in diplomatic pouches for a trafficking group led by a man called George Hatcher. Interestingly, when Michael Decker saw a personal phone book that had belonged to Hatcher, presumably while Decker was a federal witness, he noticed that the first name in the phone book was that of an arms dealer based in LA who brought guns over to Tijuana for Falcon's organization. And here's another oddity on the Morgan Arms Bolivia connection. A US intelligence report revealed that the Morgan Arms factory in LA was manufacturing weapons for a range of South American companies owned by a corporation, Condor. That corporation was based in La Paz, Bolivia. Now, whether Corporation Condor was linked to the notorious Operation Condor, which if you haven't heard of, then I would urge you to look up, I couldn't verify from publicly available sources. Conclusion. We have Morgan Arms, a US arms manufacturer, mixed up with drug traffickers by association to Falcon and this George Hatcher. It is supplying a range of South American companies operating in the mid-1970s, a time when repressive right-wing US-backed dictatorships canvass almost the entire region. And it's got this super rifle the CIA is interested in, and which it wants Falcon and Gaston Santos to invest in. What were Falcon's own motivations? Was it the money? Did he want to trade the guns for cocaine and sell it off at a huge markup on the US market? Or did he also want it for his own purposes? We'll come back to that. But that is not all we know about the arms deals. Falcon's partner, Gaston Santos, as we know, was probably the most famous and prestigious Portuguese-style bullfighter of his day. His thoroughbreds were raised in Portugal, and with his father's connections, he had serious political clout over there. There is credible evidence which links Falcon and one of his earliest associates, José Egozi Bejar, to a $250 million CIA-backed deal supplying arms and materiel to Portuguese secret services. The aim? To overthrow the leftist government that had seized power there, a right-wing counter-coup, essentially. Pretty standard stuff for the CIA at the time. We're talking light machine guns, artillery, jeeps, amphibious vehicles, the list goes on. Falcon, Santos, Kyriakides, and Egozi, although Egozi's involvement has been disputed, were splitting a $25 million cut amongst themselves for brokering and logistics. We mentioned Egozi earlier. He was one of the 4 fugitives who escaped from Lecumberri, the Miami-based millionaire and former CIA operative who'd been involved in the Bay of Pigs debacle. Rearrested with Falcon, he was found hanged in his cell in 1978. One story goes that he was strung up by fellow inmates after overturning their rations. Another rumour, suspected by DEA, was that Falcon had ordered his assassination after he had spoken to DEA behind bars. His death is certainly a mystery. Returning to the Portuguese arms deal, though, we don't know what happened to it. The Communist Party in Portugal was extremely influential and therefore worrisome to US geopolitical interests, but ultimately Portugal's transition to a pluralist democracy proved relatively non-violent. Moving on to other curiosities. You'll remember that after Falcon's escape from Lecumberri, he was rearrested and detained, and that in the middle of the night, a man had rushed over to intervene in the interrogation, essentially rescuing Falcon from Ventura and his torturers in the federal police. This was stated by Falcon himself, right out of his 1979 memoir. The man in question was called Miguel Nassar Haro. He would soon become none other than chief of Mexico's Directorate of Federal Security, the DFS, basically Mexico's CIA equivalent at the time. It's now public knowledge that the CIA helped set up the DFS in the 1940s. Thereafter, it would collaborate closely with the agency, especially in intel and covert operations in the dirty war against left-wing subversives, real or suspected. As this was the Cold War era, other US agencies and departments simply turned a blind eye. But the DFS would go on to provide state-backed protection for traffickers trying to centralize the drug trade and cash in on its enormous profits. Nassar Haro headed the DFS from 1977 to 1982, overseeing the rise to power of the ultra-centralized, ultra-powerful Guadalajara cartel. He had previously been indicted in the US for heading a trafficking ring of stolen luxury cars, smuggled from the US into Mexico. But his case was dismissed under pressure from the CIA, arguing intelligence services would be compromised without Nassar. Nassar had also headed a brutal death squad called the White Brigade, responsible for the abductions, interrogations, forced disappearances, and executions of hundreds of suspected communists in Mexico. Fittingly, the CIA referred to Nassar as, quote, its most important source in Mexico and Central America. Some questions should be asked then, questions which were also raised by Mills. Why was Nassar there while Falcon was being held by the federal police? Was he there just in his capacity as a high-level Mexican intelligence officer, gaining intel from a high-level trafficker? Was he there on Falcon's payroll to rescue him from his captors? Or was he there in his capacity as a CIA asset, aiding another CIA asset like Falcon? We could go on. Another of Falcon's key allies was this fierce-looking gangster who you might know as Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros. He was the Honduran chemist turned trafficker who linked Falcon up to major cocaine suppliers in Colombia and Peru. In fact, Mata's historical legacy is huge. The fact he was able to create safe smuggling routes through Central America as alternatives to the riskier Caribbean routes facing US crackdowns made him instrumental in the rise of the Guadalajara cartel and the so-called Mexican trampoline more generally. In the mid-70s, though, he was Falcon's man, helping him get into cocaine. After Falcon went down, Ballesteros immediately partnered up with the up-and-coming Sinaloan trafficker Miguel Felix Gallardo. Turns out Mata was also an invaluable CIA agent. The Honduran billionaire, also a well-known trafficker, set up an air transport firm called Setco, funded by the State Department, which helped ferry arms, materiel, and other, quote, humanitarian supplies to the Contras in Central America, armed insurgents waging guerrilla warfare against Nicaragua's Sandinista government. This all came to light in the Iran-Contra scandal, which exploded onto the political scene in 1986. Once having partnered up with Felix Gallardo, there is good evidence from a range of credible sources that top dons in the Guadalajara cartel helped provide the CIA with airstrips in the state of Veracruz, essentially a stopping point for narcotics, guns, and cash ferried between North, South, and Central America. And there's reason to believe corrupt elements within the DEA were also involved in the scheme. But more generally, Falcon's links to Mexican state officials at the highest levels meant he was practically, and de jure in fact as we'll see, a state official himself. Certainly one with more wealth than most, if not all, which made him a tremendously useful asset for any intelligence agency. Let's just run through some of the evidence. During Falcon's first arrest in 1975 at the safe house, police found a card etched with Falcon's name, signature, and photograph, tying him to an ultra-high-level agency called Gobernación. This was a step up from the DFS, handling surveillance and counter-surveillance operations both domestically and abroad. So it had the combined powers of the FBI and the CIA. It was a green card with gold lettering and gold rim, reserved only for the highest agents in the unit. That means it tied him directly to Mexico's top executive branch and to the president himself. Gaston Santos also had one. In the same raid, police found that Falcon had a US green card, allowing him to live and work in the US, as well as applications for Italian and French passports. This confirmed the testimony from a Gobernación insider, one who Mills Wright was collaborating with the DEA. This insider typed Falcon's name in a new computer system, and the printer immediately started pumping out sheet after sheet of intel. His boss walks in and threatens to arrest him. Somehow, the agent manages to make it out with the records, buries them under a palm tree on a Tijuana golf course, before staying in a DEA safe house across the border in San Diego. When he dug them up after 3 weeks, it stated they revealed photos and documents linking Sicilia Falcon to a heroin shipment bound for Chicago. The fact that Falcon had a direct line to President Echeverria is backed up by details from our informant in the CIA. He tells us the president, his successor, and top Mexican officials from Oaxaca and Zacatecas, among others, were planning on building a transnational railroad that would move dope right up to the US border. And they were doing it with Falcon, Gaston Santos, and Santos' father. I'll let that sink in for a moment. Here's an indication of just how explosive Sicilia Falcon's arrest was in Mexico. President Echeverria's favored successor, Mario Moya Palencia, who was the head of Gobernación and therefore the likely source for Falcon and Santos' membership there, he came up as affiliated with Falcon in investigations after the arrest. As a result, he was dumped by the PRI, who replaced him with a second favorite, President José López Portillo. But that isn't all. Falcon had deeply infiltrated US institutions as well. It became apparent to the CENTAC agents investigating the Falcon case that he had paid off legions of officials in immigration, in customs, San Diego police, Los Angeles police, and even the DEA. Smugglers and aides in Falcon circles had been at a loss as to how he was getting so much intel from North America. Likewise for the DEA investigators who had flipped them. How was it that Falcon knew where the DEA who were investigating would be nearly every time? After he went down, federal police found in the hands of Falcon's secretary and chauffeur a DEA intelligence report on prominent contemporary Cuban traffickers. Through meticulous forensic analysis of blemishes on the pages, DEA agent Bill Kuntz was able to trace the document back to a scanner at the DEA office in New Orleans. Turns out the mole was the DEA's regional head, a guy called Joe Baca. Kuntz found logs of phone calls to Falcon and Kyriakides' Acapulco villa, as well as to other powerful contacts in Mexico's politico-mafiocracy. Baca was in a totally prime position, inconspicuous in New Orleans, but also getting a lot of intel from old colleagues in LA and Mexico. As it turned out, Baca was also the cousin of Comandante Pancho Sahagún Baca, ultra-corrupt and notoriously cruel Mexican Fed in the pay of Sicilia Falcon. Joe Baca went on to deny the accusations. The DEA fired him before a federal hearing in San Diego, and he took the fifth, refused to answer any questions, and was never prosecuted thereafter. So, besides these CIA leads and just the irrefutable tentacles this guy had all over, what other evidence do we have of a CIA connection? Well, after his arrest, it was reported across Mexican media, and Mexican journalists often had better links to the police than US agents, that Falcon had confessed under torture to working with the CIA to build a drugs for arms network with Central American guerrilla groups in open rebellion against their governments. Now, Mexican media is well known for its sensationalism, but the specific nature of the charge and the fact it long predated the Iran-Contra affair should make it of interest. Falcon, it was reported, would later deny the claims. Now, the DEA agents working on the case believed Falcon had collaborated with the CIA. Michael Decker also thought he was working with the CIA, quote, first indirectly, then very directly, citing the CIA documents he read about the Morgan rifle and the Portuguese arms deal, the friendly relations Falcon had with Central American government officials, and the various jobs Falcon floated by Decker for his, quote, friends over in the United States. It's also worth mentioning a book written by journalist and author Henrik Kruger, entitled The Great Heroin Coup, Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism. Though Kruger discusses Sicilia Falcon for just a few pages, he puts forward the theory that with the loss of Vietnam and its networks in Southeast Asia, the CIA began shifting its drug headquarters to Mexico through Sicilia Falcon. And Kruger also theorizes that the CIA used an already well-established network of state corruption, one that had protected and collaborated with the Mexican mafia and French Corsican criminals for decades. Now, this might be venturing into tinfoil hat theory. Falcon could just as well have obtained these contacts through well-connected associates like Gaston Santos and Carlos Kyriakides. It is the case, though, that the institutional corruption was already well established in Mexico, and that many of Falcon's associates in government or otherwise had been involved with the French connection. DEA and former CIA agent Pat Gregory speculated Falcon wasn't just a CIA asset, potentially gathering intel on Mexican officials. He thought he likely worked for multiple intelligence agencies from different countries, and he played them to his advantage. Cuban secret services, for one. An enigmatic detail of Falcon's story was that he had a Cuban passport issued in Havana on the 12th of September 1972, which he presented when paying for a Rolls-Royce convertible in Spain by check, and another time while opening a bank account in Switzerland. What had he been doing in Havana? How did an anti-communist emigre extricated by the CIA after Castro rose to power, obtain a Cuban passport. His political allegiances do appear to be rather conflicting. He was remembered as an anti-communist by an associate, and his anti-castrista days leave little doubt about his sympathies in early adulthood. But then he did write in his memoir that his disillusionment with the anti-Castro partisan effort, led by the US, reshifted his allegiance back to Cuba's communist revolution. As an aside, we do know Falcon had links to Dolores Olmedo, one of the most influential figures in Mexico's Communist Party, and more generally in the Mexican government. That said, she was also lovers with Mexican Godfather figure and French connection heroin boss Arturo Izquierdo Hebrard, who, interestingly for this topic, owned ranches in Veracruz. Then there's Mexican intelligence agencies. Given his relationships with Mexico's highest officials, what intel, if any, was he giving them? And what did Falcon really want? Well, the DEA agents, as well as Barrueta and Deca, truly believed Falcon wanted a political power base. Whether that was toppling the Mexican government or Central American governments, he wanted to be in government, head of state even. His many musings on wanting to build, quote, his island, as testified by several former associates, suggest Falcon wanted a political power base in the Americas. Barrueta overheard Falcon discussing plans to invade Belize, or British Honduras as it was called historically, at a time when its sovereignty was in a bit of a limbo stage. And this is backed up by our CIA informant. Falcon wanted a country. Gaston Santos, through his father, was also highly well connected across Central America, and it's believed they wanted to do it together. There are still plenty of gaps in Sicilia Falcon's story, but one thing feels pretty certain: we haven't heard the last of him. With his incredible connections, he was not just another trafficker, he was the immediate precursor to Mexico's first modern cartels. And he managed to do all this in just a few years, while still in his 20s as a bisexual Cuban outsider. I'll be digging much deeper into his life, so if you knew Falcon personally and or have any new information to share, my email's in the description. Feel free to leave any comments as well. Stay tuned for more narco history coming very soon. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Thank you for watching, and see you on the next one.